We find ourselves in a society that has become subverted and inverted in almost every possible way. We can no longer distinguish between man and woman, healthy and unhealthy, good and evil. The very foundation of truth in our society is non-existent, jettisoned into the abyss of nihilism. If nihilism is to be defined, it is the unceasing destruction of truth. The nihilists will only stop until the world is a hellish void, at which point they will destroy themselves. Annihilation is the only way to achieve nihil, nothingness. But what is nihilism? Who are nihilists? How do we stop it? Father Seraphim Rose's book Nihilism is intended to answer these exact questions. Ultimately, as we have mentioned earlier, the fundamental concept of nihilism is the destruction of truth. To the nihilist, there is no absolute truth, there is only relative truth. To the nihilist, the closest thing to an absolute truth is the will to power. One of Father Seraphim Rose's key insights is the concept of nihilism as a progressive dialectic. Nihilism did not spontaneously emerge into its pure destructive form. Rather, nihilism emerged out of a multi-century-long dialectic that began with the Enlightenment. Father Seraphim Rose notes that this dialectic is not to be understood as, quote, merely chronological, but there is certainly a development of this dialectic over time. Each of the different stages of the nihilistic dialectic served to progress nihilism towards its ultimate form, the nihilism of destruction. This dialectic follows wherein more prototypical manifestations of nihilism are critiqued in order to generate more virulent strains of nihilism. However, these critiques do not serve to undermine the very concept of nihilism. In fact, the purpose of the nihilistic dialectic is to fortify it against criticisms of nihilism. Father Seraphim Rose separates the nihilistic dialectic into 4 stages: Liberalism, Realism, Vitalism, and Destruction. To him, liberalism is, quote, not an overt nihilism, it is rather a passive nihilism, end quote. To clarify, when Father Seraphim Rose uses the word, quote, liberalism, end quote, he does not mean it in the same sense that is typically used today. The use of liberalism within the context of the book is one that describes much of the thought that emerged out of the historical era known as the Enlightenment. At its core, liberalism in this context is about putting the needs and wants of the individual above the collective needs and wants of the society. In a liberal society, the essential unit is the individual. Fundamentally, liberalism is the abolishment of hierarchy. Every individual is afforded the exact same rights and status in society, whether he has earned those accolades or not. Ironically, liberalism's pathological obsession with the individual leads to the very destruction of the individual. Consider John Locke's concept of tabula rasa. In the tabula rasa model, man is born with a mind, the equivalent of a blank slate. Man does not come with the innate notions of how to process information. Implied in tabula rasa is that man does not come with a basic intuition of morality, a stark contrast to St. Paul's assertion that everyone lives with, quote, the law written on their hearts, end quote. In many ways, to the liberal, man is a slave to his environment. Consequently, this worldview functions as an absolution of man's errors. Errors are simply a result of the environment. To the liberal, bad people are bad people because of the environmental circumstances and not because of the decisions made of their own free will. Ultimately, liberalism allows for more virulent strains of nihilism to fester through its apathy to truth. To the liberal, it does not matter if someone does not want to believe in any kind of essential truth. After all, they are an individual, and any infringements on the individual would contradict liberalism. Liberalism's subversion of absolute truth is its apathy towards the enforcement of absolute truth. The next stage of the nihilistic dialectic, according to Father Seraphim Rose, is realism. Realism is, quote, a generic term which we understand as inclusive of the various forms of naturalism and positivism, end quote. The primary difference between the liberal stage of nihilism and realist stage of nihilism is the progression of agnosticism to explicit atheism. One of the more common manifestations of realism is the form of scientism. Scientism is the extension of science past its valid boundaries. Science in and of itself is simply a tool with a limited epistemological scope. We observe some physical phenomenon, develop a hypothesis, test our hypothesis, and see if the results are consistent with what we expect. This method works well for understanding physical phenomena, such as rocketry, chemical reactions, and plants. Fundamentally, the kind of, quote, truth established by science is ephemeral. A hypothesis might appear to hold as truth for a couple of decades, only for a counterexample to emerge where the hypothesis fails. This, quote, scientific truth is more temporally grounded than many other forms of truth. Consider mathematical truth as an example. The truth of the quadratic equation showing the roots of the second-degree polynomial was always true and will always be true. We can show in a proof that the quadratic equation is true, and that establishes its truth to us in the mathematical sense. The mathematical proof provides an invariant assurance of truth. Science does not have anything like a proof in mathematics. Scientific hypotheses are true until they are shown to be wrong. In the hierarchy of truth, scientific truth is relatively weak. The realist desires pure truth, but his methods for obtaining such truth are insufficient. The realist wants to assert metaphysical claims about the unknowability of ultimate reality without the acknowledgement of metaphysics. The realist is a man living in rebellion of the axioms of his reality, drowning in his own pride, desperately trying to prove these axioms himself because he cannot admit that there is something greater than himself. As realism progresses, it becomes more deranged. The pursuit no longer becomes finding some sort of absolute truth. Instead, the goal becomes to use science and other materially focused endeavors to, quote, prove God's non-existence. We can no longer study physics to understand physical reality, but we study it to prove that we do not need God to create the universe. We no longer study biology not to understand God's creation, but to prove that God did not make us, and, even worse, show that we can be, quote, God too. We no longer study the mind to understand its true essence, but to prove that our minds are just manifestations of billions of firing neurons and neurochemicals. In this vein, realism exists only in a destructive sense and principally to deny God. According to Father Seraphim Rose, the next stage of the nihilistic dialectic is Vitalism. Vitalism essentially posits that there is some essence or energy that differentiates living organisms from inanimate objects. Vitalism emerges out of realism's suffocating materialism. The vitalist is willing to admit that immaterial objects exist in the world. However, the vitalist form of non-materialism is closer to occult mysticism than to the kind of non-materialism present in Christianity. The pseudo-spiritualism that emerges out of vitalism is inherently solipsistic. Spirituality is just what it is to you without any component of universality to it. This kind of spirituality is best encapsulated in the cliché phrase, "I'm spiritual but not religious." Owing to its lack of universality, pseudo-spiritualism only contributes to the degradation of absolute truth. It asserts that spirituality is only particular to the individual, with the implication that spirituality that asserts absoluteness is false. Vitalist spirituality is a manifestation of the hyper-individualism of nihilism. Hyper-individualism functioning effectively as self-deification. Aptly, Father Seraphim Rose recognizes the dangers of pseudo-spiritualism. Quote, "Spiritualist errors are far more dangerous than any mere materialism, and we shall in fact find in part 3 of this work that most of what passes for spirituality today is in fact a new spirituality, a concern born of nihilism that attaches itself to the healthy organisms to destroy them from within." End quote. Whereas the realist tries to ground himself in some kind of truth, albeit a false one, the vitalist starts to dispel with any form of absolute truth. Vitalism is where we start to see the subversion and destruction of art, language, and culture. Art no longer exists to express beauty, beauty itself being an expression of truth and absolute order. Language no longer exists to communicate. All cultures are correct with respect to themselves. If man controls his own truth, then man is God. What can stop him now? The establishment of relative truth in vitalism leads to the ultimate stage of nihilism, the nihilism of destruction. The goal of the nihilist at this stage of the dialectic is the destruction of everything. Father Seraphim Rose states, quote, "The nihilism of destruction is not an exaggeration, it is rather a fulfillment of the deeper aim of all nihilism. In it, nihilism has assumed its most terrible, but its truest form. In the face of nothingness, discards its mask and stands revealed in all its nakedness." One of the most pure examples of the nihilism of destruction can be found in the insanity of posadism. Posadism is a particularly deranged strain of communism, which claims that a necessary condition for global communism is nuclear annihilation. Only after this point, according to the posadists, can a true global communist utopia be established. The destructive nihilist is, at his core, completely unhinged and ungrounded, reveling in the blood and chaos of carnage. The destructive nihilist fully embraces the void of nothingness and desires nothing other than it. The landscape of today is rife with nihilists of every variety. To most people, the concept of absolute truth is alien and incompatible with modern societal norms. Absolute truth necessitates absolute order and absolute authority. Many in the West suffer from what could be called the aversion to assertion. Westerners want to assert their own truths rather than have an absolute truth, quote, dictated to them. Those that assert absolute truth are reviled as the vanguard of future tyranny. However, the consequence of a lack of assertion in our own societies leads us to where we are today, the tyranny of nihilism. In a world where everyone is able to assert his own personal truth, which results in people doing what they want without any regard for the collective in which they inhabit, chaos rules over all. Furthermore, as Father Seraphim points out, those that claim to be ambivalent to the choices of individuals concerning truth almost always go out of their way to attack those that believe in the Christian truth. Seemingly, people are free to ruin their lives but not free to fix them. Even more concerning is the fact that nihilism dominates most prominent institutions in the West. The education system promotes the subversion of truth by teaching children that gender is, quote, fluid and sex is, quote, assigned at birth. The healthcare system increasingly promotes demonic practices like, quote, assisted suicide. The technological and scientific establishment is starting to seriously pursue aspects of transhumanism and the so-called, quote, man-machine merger. On top of all of this, religion, specifically Christianity, is increasingly marginalized. In this upside-down world, those that have inverted truth are now trying to claim that their model is right side up. Liberalism has been used as a Trojan horse to herd the populace into accepting, even begrudgingly, almost all forms of indecency and degeneracy. The next step is to convince people that not only are these deviations acceptable, but furthermore, they are preferable. According to the current regime, raising a child without a father is not only acceptable, but it is preferable to raising a child with a father. According to the current regime, being transgender is not only acceptable, but it is preferable to being non-transgender. You will now be terrorized socially and physically for being aligned with the true truth. As Father Seraphim states in Nihilism, the nihilistic transformation of our society is the work of the devil himself. As such, we must find ways to treat this disease. Father Seraphim states, quote, nihilism is, most profoundly, a spiritual disorder, and it is overcome only by spiritual means, and there has been no attempt whatsoever in the contemporary world to apply such means, end quote. If the nihilist agenda is truly the work of the devil, then the struggle against nihilism is best understood as spiritual warfare. St. Paul states the following regarding spiritual warfare. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against power, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. End quote. Our answer to the tyranny of nihilism dwells in the concepts of the Orthodox Revolutionary. Through many essential characteristics, the revolutionary impulse is the heart of nihilism. However, what is the role of a revolutionary in a society dominated by nihilists? In a sane world, the revolutionary exists to tear down the existing structures of society, to create a, quote, new age. However, in the upside-down world that we live in, we need to re-examine our understanding of a revolutionary. If the overarching mentality in a society is nihilistic, then a revolutionary is not one who destroys, but one who creates. If the overarching mentality in a society is nihilistic, then a revolutionary is not one who asserts relative truth, but one who asserts absolute truth. Fundamentally, in our society, dominated by nihilists as it may be, orthodoxy is revolutionary. The future for the Orthodox will be rife with struggle, but in that struggle we find our purpose. For without this struggle, God would not know the true nature of our souls. How can a man know if he is truly good if he has never had the opportunity to make the wrong decision? Man's choice to be with God through Christ is his ultimate redemption from Adam's ill-fated decision in the Garden of Eden. Fundamentally, our correct use of our God-given free will is the actualization of our creation. In spite of a million different ways in which we can go the wrong way, we choose the correct course. The surrendering of our will to God's, the proper use of our free will, is spiritual heroism. Any form of heroism is built upon the principle of self-sacrifice. In spiritual heroism, we sacrifice our life in this world for our life in the next world. We sacrifice our superficial desires for our ultimate purpose. Spiritual heroism is what is necessary to defeat nihilism. We conclude this essay with a quote from a veritable embodiment of spiritual heroism, St. Luke of Simferopol. Quote, I believe deeply in God, and I have built my whole life upon His commandments. For a long time and with great patience I sailed against the current, and to you, my children, I bequeath that you too must also sail against the current, no matter how difficult that is. Avert your gaze and turn your heart away from the great majority of humans who do not pursue higher goals, but rather those that are easy to acquire. The purpose of your lives should be to endorse the highest truth and steadfastly cling to it, even when they force you to serve other purposes by trampling upon the truth of Christ. Be ready even for martyrdom, since you are sailing against the current.